The morning sky over Moscow was the color of cold steel, and the wind carried a sharp bite that cut through the empty expanse of Red Square. The snow, freshly fallen overnight, muffled the city's usual rhythm. Inside the Kremlin, however, silence was not peace, it was pressure. Deep in the fortified underground chamber, the air was tense. Massive digital screens projected satellite images, live feeds and streams of classified intelligence. Every flicker of red on the map marked NATO troop movements. Every glowing blue dot represented a Russian military position. The room was filled with the low-hum machines and the heavy breathing of men who knew history was about to shift. President Vladimir Putin stood at the head of a long mahogany table, his hands resting on a single red folder embossed with the Russian coat of arms and the stark word, "Sekretna," top secret. Across from him sat his senior generals, the heads of the FSB and key ministers. The tension in their faces mirrored the gravity of the moment. "Comrades," Putin began, his voice low but steady, "for years we have tolerated provocation. We were promised security, but instead they built missiles on our borders." He pointed to the digital map. An American missile shield had just been activated in Poland and Romania. "They have surrounded us with steel and deceit." General Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff, leaned forward. "Our reconnaissance confirms heavy equipment moving toward Lithuania and Latvia. It's a clear preparation for forward deployment." Putin paused, eyes narrowing. The room seemed to freeze with him. "Then they have made their choice," he said. He opened the red folder and signed the presidential directive for Plan Z, a full defensive mobilization along the Western Front. "Prepare all divisions for immediate readiness. Cyber operations begin at midnight. All strategic missile units go to alert status," he ordered. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint scratch of pens taking notes and the mechanical clicks of encrypted transmissions being sent. Outside the Kremlin walls, Moscow remained deceptively calm. People sipped coffee, traffic flowed, children hurried to school. Yet above them, in the cold, high air, the wings of fighter jets were already glinting against the rising sun. Russia had begun to move. The world, though it didn't yet know it, had just stepped onto the edge of a knife. The grey morning sky over Brussels seemed to mirror the mood inside. NATO headquarters, grim, heavy and uncertain. The building, a fortress of glass and steel, buzzed with tension as diplomats, generals, and aides hurried through the halls, clutching classified reports. Every television screen showed the same breaking headline: "Russia mobilizes troops. Putin signs directive for Plan Z." In the heart of the compound, the North Atlantic Council chamber was filled with the sound of urgent voices and clattering keyboards. The long circular table, usually a place of calm, diplomacy, had become a battlefield of words. "Article 4 must be invoked immediately," shouted Poland's ambassador, his voice echoing against the chamber walls. "Russian divisions are already near Suwałki Gap. If we hesitate, we risk losing our border before dawn." The Baltic representatives nodded fiercely in agreement. The Estonian delegate slammed a folder onto the table, scattering photographs taken by drones, columns of Russian armor advancing through frozen forests. "They're not exercising," she said sharply. "They're preparing." At the head of the table, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg tried to maintain composure. "We need verification," he said firmly. "Article 4 brings the alliance into immediate consultation, but we must act with precision. The wrong move could ignite a war none of us can control." But the room was already slipping into chaos. The German representative argued for restraint, urging diplomacy. The British Defence Minister demanded an air patrol over Eastern Europe within hours. The French envoy warned that any escalation could spiral into nuclear confrontation. Then the door opened abruptly. A security officer stepped in and handed a tablet to Stoltenberg. His face hardened as he read the latest intelligence report. Russian cyber units had begun targeting NATO communication grids in Poland and Latvia. "This is no longer theoretical," he said grimly. "They've started electronic warfare." Within minutes, the Council reached consensus. The Secretary General pressed a button on his console. connecting to all member states. By unanimous decision, he announced, NATO invokes Article 4. All member nations prepare for joint defense coordination. Red lights flashed across the operations board. Fighter jets were ordered to scramble from Ramstein Air Base in Germany. Warships repositioned in the Baltic and Black Seas. Outside, sirens wailed as Brussels went on high alert. The alliance had spoken. The Cold War's ghost had returned, and this time it was awake. The night sky over Washington, D.C. glowed faintly red from the city lights. But inside the White House, there was only darkness, tension, and the low hum of crisis. The Situation Room was crowded with officials, some exhausted, some panicked, all aware that the world was sliding toward catastrophe. On the massive screen at the front of the room, a real-time satellite map flickered with movement. Russian armored columns advancing west. NATO air patrols circling over the Baltic. A digital chessboard where every move could trigger the unthinkable. Acting President Elaine Whitmore, the former vice president who had taken over after Donald Trump's recent election defeat, stood silently as her advisors argued around her. The election chaos had split America in two. Protests filled the streets. News anchors shouted over each other. Half the country refused to accept the results. The other half demanded immediate action against Moscow. "We can't wait for Congress," barked General Matthews, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. "If we delay, NATO will be overrun. Putin is betting on our paralysis. But deploying forces now without authorization could start World War III," countered Secretary of State Reynolds, his face pale with exhaustion. "We need coordination with the Allies, not a unilateral strike." Whitmore rubbed her temples, staring at the flashing word on the screen. DEFCON 3. The last time America had reached that level of alert was during the 1973 Middle East crisis. "If we raise it any higher," she said softly, "the world will know we're preparing for war." Her communications officer approached hurriedly. "Madam President, we're receiving reports that Russian cyber units have breached our Eastern European satellites. We're blind over the Polish corridor." The room fell silent. Only the sound of the ticking wall clock echoed in the background, a cruel reminder that time was running out. Whitmore finally spoke, her tone steady but grave. "Inform Brussels we are initiating full coordination under Article 4. Mobilize carrier groups in the North Sea and Mediterranean. And make sure Moscow understands any attack on NATO soil will be treated as an attack on the United States." The order was sent. Outside, in the rain-soaked streets of Washington, protesters chanted and sirens wailed. America, divided and uncertain, stood once again at the edge of history, and across the ocean, the Kremlin was already listening. A pale dawn crept across Europe, but it brought no warmth, only the cold silence before disaster. In Kyiv, the sound of distant explosions rolled like thunder over the horizon. Air raid sirens wailed through the grey streets, echoing between apartment blocks as families rushed into underground shelters, clutching blankets, children, and phones streaming the news. In Warsaw, subway tunnels became improvised bunkers. People crowded together, their faces ghostly in the dim emergency lights. Radios crackled with broken messages from NATO headquarters. "Remain calm. Do not panic. NATO forces are on high alert." Yet everyone could feel it. The fragile thread of peace was fraying. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the Chancellor addressed the nation from a secure bunker beneath the Reichstag. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "We stand with our allies. We will not yield to aggression." Outside, tanks rolled down empty highways toward the east, their engines roaring in the morning mist. At the United Nations in New York, chaos reigned. Diplomats shouted across the chamber, their translations overlapping in a storm of accusation. "Russia has violated international law," one delegate screamed. "NATO provoked this war," another retorted. The Security Council was paralyzed. Each resolution met with a veto. Words had become as useless as broken glass. In London, emergency meetings convened in Downing Street. Fighter jets thundered overhead, streaking toward Eastern Europe. Citizens lined up at gas stations and supermarkets, hoarding supplies, fearing the worst. The stock markets plunged, and communication networks flickered under cyber attacks traced to unknown sources. Above it all, in the silent blackness of orbit, satellites captured haunting images. Two enormous armies massed on either side of the border, NATO and Russia, staring at each other across frozen ground. Neither side moved. Neither dared to. Inside the Kremlin, Putin watched the live feed from a secure command post. His expression was unreadable. Across the Atlantic, Acting President Whitmore stood before her advisers, hands clasped tightly, waiting for the next intelligence update. Every leader knew what one mistake could mean. One miscommunication, one missile fired in panic, and the world would burn. As the sun rose over a trembling planet, billions watched their screens, waiting for a message, any sign that reason would prevail. But the only message that came was silence. The world held its breath, standing on the edge of a war that might end it forever.